to welcome Luke Seaber. And Luke Seaber is a Senior Teaching Fellow in Modern European Culture and Senior Coordinator for the Undergraduate Preparatory Certificate for the Humanities at University College London. And in fact, if we had been in our usual in-person location, we would have been in that very building that Luke works in. So at least so being online, we are able to welcome so many of you from across the world. But our initial plan was that this would be a very sort of conveniently located seminar. So Luke is the author of G.K. Chesterton's Literary Influence on George Orwell, A Surprising Irony in 2012, and Incognito Social Investigation in British Literature, Certainties in Degradation in 2017. And he's published various articles and chapters on British literature in the 19th and 20th centuries, and is co-editor with Michael McCluskey, who I think we have here this evening, of the quite recently published Aviation in Literature and Culture of Interwar Britain, very beautifully presented, beautifully illustrated volume, and also with Nick Hubble and Eleanor Taylor, the volume on the 1930s in the Bloomsbury Decades of Fiction series this year. He's currently working on Illusion in the 20th century and on infrastructure and culture in interwar Britain, as well as writing a biography of Celia Fremlin. And this evening he is going to be speaking about, from this new culture of the air we finally see, groundmindedness in the 1930s. There is a handout with some quotes on in a PDF in the chat, and hopefully people can see that in the chat. Someone could just give me a nod or a yes. You can see a PDF. Oh, okay. We might need to reshare it, Luke, just because it was, yeah, okay. Just one moment while we do that. We shared it before the session started, and I think that might mean that people who joined after that point are unable to see that. So I'll just keep talking in the meantime. There it is, ready for you to download if you want to put that up on your screens. So we'll hear Luke talk, we'll then take questions at the end. Of course, if you do want to put questions in the chat as we go along, feel free to do so, and I'll get back to those at the end. And if I can just remind everyone to keep muted while you're not talking. So with that, thanks very much, Luke. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I was expecting this to be the shortest distance I ever had to travel for a seminar. It's even shorter. I literally haven't left the chair, let alone the office. So this is the first time I've ever read anything over Zoom like this. I've only ever taught asynchronously and recorded myself with time to make mistakes. So I apologize in advance if I drop my papers and start swearing. I shall try not to. So I'm literally reading from next to my screen. If things do vanish, it's because they literally have fallen off my desk. In his bizarre but best-selling Pot Boy of 1936, England Have My Bones, which is a sort of country diary, he makes his journal of living in the country into a book published in 1936. T.H. White writes at a certain point that it was a good day, really. Air-minded till lunch, county-minded at the tennis party till supper, and beer-minded playing nap at Tenmere till they closed. A lot of the book is taken up with T.H. White's learning to fly. And in a passage like this, which Valentine Cunningham quotes, we see that typical, stereotypical 30s air-mindedness. I can't do inverted commas very easily because I'm holding this in one hand. That stereotypical 30s air-mindedness, that manifestation of the zeitgeist where we have an interest in, obsession with even flying an airman. Rex Warner's The Aerodrome, Day-Lewis's apostrophizing Auden as lone flyer birdman. There are many examples, classic examples, almost cliched examples at this point. Many of them can be found in Valentine Cunningham's huge British writers of the 30s, including that quote from T.H. White. Cunningham writes that never before or since have poetry and the novel been so obsessed by the action, the clutter, the machinery, the terminology, the termini of traveling by air. And this novelty, this modernity of the aeroplane, whether distant or near, its sheer excitement it conveys is synecdochic for modernity as a whole. None of this is very new. This question of air-mindedness by now is quite an old one. And this synecdoche can work more pathetically. It isn't always spectacular, if you like. The fact of flying at a certain point becomes unremarkable, and as such represents the march of modernity, which may be massive, it may be terrifying in how inexorable it is, but it's terrifying precisely because it's become normal, it's become quotidian. This is shown, I think, brilliantly at the end of John Betjeman's Death of King George V, which works as a commentary to his own epigraph of new king arrived in his capital by air, daily newspaper. Old men who never cheated, never doubted, communicated monthly, sit and stare at the new suburbs stretched beyond the runway, where a young man lands hatless from the air. This is 1936, and the victory of flying, by extension, air-mindedness, modernity perhaps in general, is almost being shown as complete in one sense. It's no more exotic, no more exciting than suburbia or not wearing a hat. It may be momentous in what it implies to an older generation regarding the world that they see vanishing. Ultimately, though, it is as domesticated and as domestic as the miles of suburban villas surrounding London, around Croydon in this case. Nonetheless, this may on one level seem opposed to the sort of air-mindedness that Cunningham and many others have discussed, but its base, the central point, if you like, remains the same. Modernity is represented by the aeroplane and or its pilot, and the gaze is that of the ground-based observer looking skywards or, at the very least, aircraftwards. Today, though, I wish to argue that discussions of interwar flight focusing on air-mindedness in this sense, that is, looking towards the aeroplane, looking up, are incomplete, because they exclude something that is related, but far from identical, or if not, they conflate it with air-mindedness. And I should be calling the phenomenon that I'm talking about groundmindedness. And to see what this is, let's return to T.H. White. So the comment above about being air-minded comes from his diary entry for the 8th of July, 1934. A few days later, he has a combined entry for the 21st and 22nd of July. This details his first real flight after he's begun learning to fly, in which he's a passenger rather than a pupil. He describes various flying experiences before that, but they are flying experiences which he's learning to fly. This is his first flight as a passenger. It's really, as we shall see, one long descriptive passage, which I'm now going to read out in its entirety, as it's the most sustained example I know from the period of this type of writing. So this is from the 21st, 22nd of July entry for T.H. White's 1934 diary, as republished and reworked in England Have My Bones, published in 1936. Roland was the pilot. As I had nothing to do in the front cockpit, I scribbled all Saturday. Traffic at Heston, Ford below, cemetery toothpick spillikins, keyboard treads, toy grey flat glass river wash, slow nosing, motionless basset loke, more gothic piqué regularity of London armadillo or horned toad, vibro massage. Cut out. The oval proud to recognise, probably not, was Australians. Roland, I wonder what the press would say if we shot them up. White dentales of Tower Bridge, timber boats at docksides, yellow just like river rack, bunkers, golf, smallpox, white beards of barges, 4 to 5,000, forbidden area, ammunition dump, real liners, suddenly cloud white rushing at wisps, blank thin, out more coming, kick, enjoy, fear. Valkyria charge, under us, frightened that it should go so fast, down at 120, want to smoke, chalk, amusing fort near Rochester Aerodrome, stooped corn like pinstripe trousers, clouds again, black above, airline crossing thick mist, nice little engine scooting along by itself looking busy, the scrophulus of the earth, sick, limb, the grey mud sea line ending the world, mist, out of the world through the backcloth, clouded linoleum, one seagull, a flake, capri, sweet saliva in mouth, ships, tankers, mother hippo, practically no bumps over sea, all near limb, flat as hat, clearer. Little cloud, streak, France, the small oblong numerous surf fields of North France and Belgium, patch quilt or parka, inlay, Zeebrugge indistinct interest, coming back sand racing, the cross on the hill near Erith, Ashford, 8,000 feet over Wiltshire, the great saffron cloud towers, Lux, soap suds, sun starboard, moon port, earth blue, this keen air going at them, the feeling of don't dare to stunt or flying anything but straight and level at this insignificance. Be careful, be modest, beware, distrust of wings and tails, going at, I shake with cold and fear, but going through I like, till he curls, then cling in terror. This is the first real passage like this in the book. There are a couple of others, and it's certainly the only one of any length, anything near this length. That is to say, one which describes the landscape as seen from an aeroplane. And this is the phenomenon really that I should be discussing today under the name of groundmindedness. This looking down, not the looking up of air-mindedness or even the looking at the aircraft, but the looking down towards and at the ground. And this gives an importance to flying that lies not just in itself, not just in symbolic airmen and technological modernity, but in what flying made possible, the landscape as seen from the sky. And I don't think it's coincidental, by the way, that for White, this passage, quite a remarkable passage, very Joycean, I think. It only becomes writable when he's not flying. He's not air-minded. He's not thinking about flying. He's a passenger. For the first time, he's a true passenger, and he's literally looking down. He's no longer air-minded. He's, in my sense, ground-minded. Now, Valentine Cunningham does discuss this alongside air-mindedness. The corollary of looking up was, of course, looking down. he doesn't really explore those non-political implications or tease out quite what distinguished it from earlier similar phenomena. So he notes that from the airman's position, people appear less than human, and how the new photography of Mohinoj, Rodchenko, Bayer, that adopts the looking down angle, the elevated camera characteristically sees people as dehumanized puppets, tokens, manipulable objects, dolls, midgets. Now, this is all true, of course, as far as it goes, but mutatis mutandis, it doesn't really differ from something much earlier, like Louis Loir's very famous 1874 criticism of the First Impressionist exhibition and Monet's Le Boulevard des Capucines. And note, by the way, how many Impressionist streetscapes are literally views de haut en bas. They're literally looking down at the city. Where Loire, in the guise of a rather sarcastic exhibition visitor, writes, I'm translating here, all I want to tell you is all I want you to tell me is what all those little black licks at the bottom of the painting represent. They're people walking. What? So I look like that when I'm walking along the Boulevard des Capucines. So this is if you like, is an older form of proto-ground-mindedness, I suppose we could call it, where we already have that question of looking down. But it's related, but it's early and it's not the same thing. What we get with aircraft is different, I think. And what I want to argue now is that there's much more to groundmindedness, as I'm calling it, than this dehumanizing effect. It's not just a question of looking down at these little black tongue lickings of paint and what on earth are they. It's not just a question of looking down it's not just looking down from the Ferris wheel, so to speak, in Vienna at the ants running around. There's other things going on ground-minded. And more generally, talking about how reference to flight in the 30s, the way I'm looking at it, have as much to do with reference to this new visual experience as they do with flight itself, can be seen in another passage that's much discussed, much studied when we're talking about interwar prose descriptions, at least of flying, which is Ginger Nina's honeymoon flight to a top holdable spot not far from Monty in Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies, so from 1930. It's another long passage of my reading, I'm afraid. Ginger looked out of the aeroplane. I say, Nina, he shouted, when you were young, do you ever have to learn a thing out of a poetry book about this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this something or other Eden? Yes, why? Well, I mean, to say, don't you feel somehow up in the air like this and looking down and seeing everything underneath? I mean, don't you have a sort of feeling rather like that, if you see what I mean? Nina looked, and this is the bit that really interests me. Nina looked down and saw inclined at an odd angle horizon of straggling red suburb, arterial roads dotted with little cars, factories, some of them working, others empty and decaying, a disused canal, some distant hills sown with bungalows, wireless masts and overhead power cables. Men and women were indiscernible except as tiny spots. They were marrying and shopping and making money and having children. The scene lurched and tilted again as the airplane struck a current of air. I think I'm going to be sick, said Nina. And then we do have that dehumanizing thing to an extent there, with these little dots moving around. But again, I think there's more going on here. So this obvious satire on contemporary England, this rather sordid visual reality compared with Shakespeare's nobler but imagined bird's eye view, is made possible by this new way of seeing the ground and the possibilities offered by aviation. The implied comparison of people to ants is no longer solely a metaphor born from yet another piece of authorial fancy. It's become observational. This is a view of modernity made possible by modernity. The gaze, though, is looking away from the air, and the modern lies as much, or perhaps rather more, in what is being viewed instead of where it's being viewed from. In fact, we might even conclude that this passage is only possible, not so much only because of the existence of aviation, which allows the visual that's being commented upon. It is also an indicator, I find rather interesting, of ignorance of aviation. Because if Ginger, as he must be, if Ginger is heading towards France from London, we must presume that from Croydon, he would head towards Lymm. And even if unless he cleared customs at Hendon, he's still heading though towards Lymm roughly. In other words, he must be flying over South London. But this description, disused canal, factories along arterial roads, suburbia still to get through, hills in the distance, the suggestion strikes me far more, not Hendon or Croydon, but West London. In other words, what Waugh is describing is not what you would have been seen from there. There's a shared ignorance between author and presumed readership here. And it reminds me of what John Sutherland says about when Dickens describes Magwitch's swimming in Great Expectations, how Magwitch swims when still in leg irons. Magwitch's swim to shore was generally unremarked on because Dickens's readers shared his vagueness about what human limits are in the water. In other words, there's this shared, I mean, ignorance is a strong word, shared ignorance, lack of interest in the technicalities of aviation and air routes. I mean, if I said now, if I described flying, I don't know, from London to Edinburgh, and I described going out over the Channel, people would pick this up, I imagine. But the Waugh here is safely if you like, ignorant about where one would fly in order to go from London to Monte Carlo, London to Paris. And again, so what is important is what is seen, not the above from which it is seen. Another different but related example, especially in terms of air route, is in Elizabeth Bowen's To the North from 1932, 2 years later. So the characters Emmeline and Marquis fly to Le Bourget from Croydon, to London to Paris, pretty much. Their responses, though, to what they see differ notably. Marquis, who has never flown before, is less interested in the new landscape, which is revealed, than Emmeline, who has flown before, is. Her eyes kept imploring him to look down and enjoy Surrey. Surrey and Kent looked flatter and, like something with which one has ceased to have any relationship, noticeably less interesting. He had never liked either much. The grass, lawns and meadows, poorer in texture than he expected, looked like a rubbed billiard cloth. But to Emmeline, some quite new plan of life, forgotten between flight and flight, seemed once more to reveal itself. She sat gazing down with intensity at the layout of gardens. And the different responses to what they see mirror Marquis and Emmeline's different characters, their different psychological state. Jadedness, despite the novelty of the experience, intensity and a sense of connection, despite the familiarity of the experience, these in turn mirroring aspects of the underlying relationship. But this psychological symbolism of how they view the world, literally view the world, is placed in a context where what they are viewing is the world seen anew. The passage, in other words, is made absolutely possible by aviation, but it's not about aviation. It's not dwelling on the aviation, it's dwelling on the world that it makes newly visible, or visible in a new way. And the difference, I think, between this passage about Bowen's and that of War's lies in those 2 years between 1930 and 1932. Ginger and Nina's flight, although it presumes the reader's shared historical awareness of the real possibility that they are seeing, what they are seeing, it doesn't in fact ground itself, the pun is unavoidable, I apologize, it doesn't in fact ground itself in real flight. Emmeline and Marquis, however, depart from a very recognizable Croydon, down to the absolutely unmistakable at the time detail of the sexagonal seat around the little fairest of clocks. It's so absolutely obvious in the context of 1932. Obviously, this is the real airport, absolutely recognizable, that famous seat in Croydon Airport. So between War and Bowen, between 1930 and 1932, really, I suppose, flying becomes something in these texts that readers can be expected to know about in a far less abstract way, as one might expect given the expansion of air travel. And War himself can be counted as one of the people contributing to making the realities of flying better known to the reading public. Vile Bodies comes out in 1930. That same year, War also publishes the first of his travel books, Labels, A Mediterranean Journey. Chiefly, this describes a cruise War took around Mediterranean on Stella Polaris. Interestingly, organized commercial pleasure cruising of this type was also a novelty, also an innovation, which I think tends to be relatively invisible. It's happening at the same time as what's going on in aviation, but whereas obviously, if you like, aviation is new and exciting, going on a cruise around the Med isn't, but it was. They're both part of these same changes, these same new things. So, but War's, I think, it's rather an eventful trip. It begins with something far more obviously a form of modernity in transport, which is his flight from Croydon to Le Bourget for Paris. Train then takes him to Monaco in a brief interval of somewhat more traditional traveling between these two moments of modernity. So this flight, which he took in 1929, is clearly a source for the de-romanticized one described in Vile Bodies. Best example is War is sick into the little brown paper bag provided for me. This becomes Ginger's informing Nina. That's what the paper bags are for. This, by the way, I managed to slip sick bag into the index of the aviation book, which I was childishly proud of. So we now also have, though, I think, what should be a familiar response to flight, the description of the view. This, though, too, is rather unedifying in its way, just as a whole rather underwhelming, vomiting-inducing experience is in this description. It reads similarly to a less humorous draft of the scene involving Ginger and Nina. So this is War from Labels in 1930, describing his 1929 flight. The view was fascinating for the first few minutes we were in the air, and after that, very dull indeed. It was fun to see houses and motor cars, looking so small and neat. Everything had the air of having been made very recently. It was also clean and bright. After a very short time, one tires of this aspect of scenery. So this is expanded, in fact, made less factually correct in the novel. Here, any putative importance given to this new view of the world is further undercut by War's explicitly comparing it unfavorably to more traditional vantage points, such as the citadel at Cairo, or Canoni Point at Corfu, or the top of the mountain road of Cataro. Cataro is the modern Kotor in Montenegro. So the importance of War's description in Labels of his flight, which he summarizes as disagreeable but quite unexciting, lies not so much in his description of the flight itself, as it does in his description of the processes involved in the journey. He takes the reader through the various steps: the coach from London to Croydon, was included as part of one's ticket, the weighing of the luggage to determine how much to be added to the ticket price, the type of chairs once aboard, the fur-lined foot baths against the cold, the aforementioned brown paper bags, and the fact that one either has to throw them after use out of the window or down the lavatory, rather unpleasantly, the passport and luggage inspection after landing, the final coach journey to Paris. In short, in this section, Waugh not only de-romanticizes flight as he does in Vile Bodies, coming out in the same year, 1930, but he also demystifies it. He provides some of that knowledge, some of that familiarity, the absence of which Vile Bodies presumes, but the presence of which, to the north, 2 years later, presumes. And Waugh is part of that familiarization, I think, for a certain part of the reading public. Interestingly, 4 years later, 4 years after Labels, so in 92 Days, in 1934, his book about traveling around British Guiana, a travel book that very much not concerned with air travel, concerned with sort of daring do and trying to wander through the jungle and failing. Waugh also de-romanticizes groundmindedness, or at least would appear to. So he's talking about his very slow progress through the Guianese jungle, but he compares it favorably with travel in Europe, where with modern communications, you lose any sense of heightened enjoyment of the change of scenery. As when you travel by aeroplane, where all scenery is meaningless as a page from an atlas, as flat and as conventionally coloured, while between you and it lie fathoms of air and sunlight. So groundmindedness here is associated with, supposedly, the dull and familiar type of European travel with which he and his readers are allegedly familiar. But I would argue that although the form of travel and what one sees is meaningless, is conventional, if you like, in Waugh's description of it, the fact of seeing that view, the mere fact of seeing it, and not what is seen, but actually the fact of seeing it, is still, I think, new and I think strange. This conjunction while between you and it, between you and the view, while between you and it lie fathoms of air and sunlight, I think it can, and I think it should be read, not only as temporal, at the same time you see this dull view, you are above it, it's very literal and dull and boring in that sense, but it's also, I think, above all, aversitive. The view may be dull, but the fact remains that it is a technological marvel. You are sitting fathoms of air and sunlight above it. And also, I think there's a deep implied strangeness of a measure, fathom, most associated with water, the lightless depths. But it's being used for height, it's being used for air and sunlight, suggesting how the strange and the familiar combine in groundmindedness in the sense by 1934 for Waugh. We go back, though, to Labels. Waugh compares the dullness of his flight to France, his second ever flight, with the excitement of his first. So when Waugh flies to France in 29, it's the second time he's ever flown. His first flight was a little early. This, though, is described something much more exciting in Labels. It's described as a memorable experience. He loops the loop, and during which, even more than the fairground ride he compares it to, in Labels, one's nerves reach the highest point of excitement, trembling between ordinary healthy terror and mad panic. He also relates, he's joking, but there's still a certain level of seriousness about the level of psychic stress involved by the excitement, by the novelty of these flights. How 3 people were converted to Catholicism due to the intensity of the experience before the intrepid pilot came down in flames. And to some people, it seems that the Protestant God had asserted supremacy in a fine Old Testament manner. Now, humorous hyperbole aside, it's clear this first flight of Waugh's is a far more exciting one than the one he rather dully and sedately takes to France. Okay, but we have to be careful. Excitement is not the same as unfamiliarity. And although the Waugh's first flight may at first appear to be, if you like, more suitable as an example of air-mindedness, if you like, its removal from the normal human sphere into one rather more sublime, it does in fact have more in common with groundmindedness. So Waugh's first flight was during his last term at Oxford. It was with an ex-officer of the RAF who appeared in Port Meadow with a very dissolute-looking Avro biplane and advertised passenger flights for 7 and 6pence or 15 shillings for stunting. Or has the ecstatic excitement of looping the loop because he pays the extra, he pays 15 shillings, he has a stunt flight. So this modern excitement that his account might seem to convey is really, in fact, quite domesticated on many levels. It's popular entertainment. It's a fairground ride. And it's no coincidence that, again, the comparison Waugh gives for this first flight of his is as unexotic and familiar. Still exciting, though, as a fairground ride. And the one actual description of the flight that he gives, rather than the fairground comparison, rather than the long anecdote about conversion, is really quite brief. And it is, reversed, admittedly, another example of groundmindedness. One looks down into an unfathomable abyss of sky, while over one's head a great umbrella of fields and houses have suddenly opened. This umbrella of fields and houses is groundmindedness standing on one's head, as it were. So even with such an exciting stunt flight as this, one of the chief attractions of it, one of the chief memories remaining from it for war, is seeing the Earth from the air. That, again, it's something by now that we're all familiar with. Well, perhaps we're all familiar with, although we're all forgetting it now, probably, given how long it's been since anyone's flown. Again, the heart of how, though, I'm defining groundmindedness. And something I find very interesting is how having this type of flight as one's first flying experience, not a flight for travel, was so normal for the period. It's a domestication of modernity, a reduction of the unfamiliar and the new to the familiar and the safe, technologically safe, we hope, as well as socio-psychologically. It's a form purely of entertainment, flying as entertainment, looking at the ground from above as entertainment, and flight being reduced, if you like, to that. So war, like thousands of other people, had as his first flying experience something based around the novelty of looking down from a moving object at a great height onto the landscape. This was also T.H. White's first experience of flying, also in Aerodrome. And on that day, he in fact not only had a sightseeing flight, also a stunt flight. He had two. But again, the important thing is not just the experience of going up in the air, not just the experience of moving around. It's that fact of looking down, that experience of seeing the Earth from above. Even if one's pilot on a joy flight like this was someone as illustrious, someone as air-minded, in the public eye at least, as Charles Lindbergh, one's first flight could still be ground-minded. And like that of Ben Nicholson in 1935. So Harold Nicholson writes to Vita Sackville-West, his wife, recording their older son's experience. And what he foregrounds is not the act of flying, not the fact of flying itself, but what one sees when doing so. So Sackville-West had made her husband promise never to fly again. He had a really quite bad accident in 1923. And the envy that he semi-humorously expresses of their son in his letter is not of flying, but of the views seen when flying. I did so envy him, damn you. That perfect summer's day, that lovely island-studded sea, those distant mountains, that vault of blue above the scent of pines. Again, it's about what one sees from the air. One of the most important figures for groundmindedness in interwar poetry, and actually, for that matter, post-war poetry, I think, the person I'm now going to spend really the rest of today talking about is H Orton. His first experience of flying too fits into this pattern. It would, as far as I know, I don't think any of this has been published. I have this from Speaking of Edward Mendelssohn. I don't think this has been published especially. But Auden's first experience of flying, summer of 1930, something called Father Parker's Scout Camp. This would appear to be the Beaumont College Officer Training Corps camp run by a Jesuit called Francis Parker. So Auden's first experience of flight fits very much into this model of doing it for fun, doing it as entertainment, doing it for looking down. And if we begin looking for examples of landscapes described from on high as from an aeroplane, in Auden's poetry, his early poetry, they're not difficult to find. And the importance of him to what I'm calling groundmindedness, I think, becomes clear. And an obvious starting point would appear to be consider from March 1930. So March 1930 before his summer 1930 first experience of flying. So this is beginning of consider. Consider this in our time as the hawk sees it, or the helmeted airman. The clouds rift suddenly. Look there at cigarette ends smouldering on a border at the first garden party of the year. If we think about this for a moment, though, I think this is air-mindedness, not ground-mindedness. At most, it is air-mindedness with a little bit of sort of pseudo-ground-minded imagery. The zooming in is too precise. Whatever the hawk or the helmeted airman, that air-minded figure, almost cliched air-minded figure of Auden's, you literally cannot see his thrown away cigarette butt from an aeroplane. And I'm making this deliberately, sort of a very deliberately literal reading, because one of my points here is how what once upon a time would have been purely poetic also becomes literal, also becomes real. So something like Consider, none of this requires ground-mindedness. None of this, actually, a poem like Consider, it's air-minded, certainly, but none of it requires that new view of the Earth's surface. It requires the idea of somebody flying. It doesn't require having seen or a shared knowledge of seeing from above, merely the idea of the helmeted airman. In other words, the focus is as much, in fact, the focus is more on the aerial viewer than the terrestrial scene being viewed. If we want an example of truly equal mixing of ground and air-mindedness, also including, in fact, that exact collocation that Auden uses, helmeted airmen. It can be found in Stephen Spender's 1938 play, Trial of a Judge, Petra's dying brother speaking to his late brother's fiancée. As the helmeted airman again, as the helmeted airman regards the glazed focus of height, the distant silent city abandoned like a leaf, with veins in microscopic detail beneath him. Again, the remarkable visual image of the city's streets far below the skeleton of a leaf, and the audacious, it's almost oxymoronic, fusing of the telescopic and microscopic points of view is ground-minded. But it continues as he looks ahead to the life of the niece or nephew whom he'll never see. So from my towered paws of death, O sweet carrier of life, my riveted eye looks 30 years forward when your child is grown. And here, the importance of the helmeted airman, that use of riveted, this is back to an air-minded, technologically based, airman-centric point of view. We have air-mindedness and ground-mindedness both in this passage. Again, that's what I want to get away from. I want to get away from that quite well-studied air-minded set of imagery. Go back to Auden and ground-mindedness. Ground-minded images, as I'm calling them, are scattered throughout his poetry in the 30s. Various instances, far off like floating seas the ships on this island, 1935. Scene when nights are silent, the bean-shaped comic island, 5 songs, which is probably 1933. Key visual idea here is the phenomenon of seeing from a distant height. These are images applying a line of sight from great altitude. Whatever the symbolic value of the simile of ships like floating seas, the visual aspect, the literal aspect, if you like, is surely one that, from my point of view at least, changes totally with the possibility of the words calling up in the reader's mind a sight that is only literally possible from the advent of aviation. I think something changes when what is being described, if you like, poetically is literally something one can possibly see, as opposed to only seeing with one's mind's eye. So new shared visual knowledge also underpins, for example, the following quite famous lines from A Summer Night, June 1933. Now north and south and east and west, those I love lie down to rest. The moon looks down on them all. She climbs the European sky. Churches and power stations lie alike among Earth's fixtures. Now the aviatrix here is the poetically really quite traditional, cliched even, moon. And if we stay at the level of meaning, the potential indistinguishability of church and power station is almost cliche. There's nothing particularly interesting on one level about that. And I think what makes it interesting, particularly interesting though, is that now both the poet and the poet's readers know it is not just a poetic point. This is something absolutely literal now. At night from the sky, buildings are of course relatively indistinguishable. I think that there's a very important difference that we generally, I think, hasn't been dealt with enough, especially in Auden's poetry. There is a difference between knowing this is a piece of imaginative or poetic reasoning and knowing it either from personal experience or from aerial photography. And it's in this difference between moving from the purely poetic, if you like, to the experiential that groundmindedness lies, the importance of groundmindedness lies. I think the most important, one at least I find most interesting, of the instances in which Auden uses the view of the world seen from several thousand feet, come not exactly in his poetry, but in his drama The Chase, never performed, totally unperformable, from 1934. In its opening lines, I think it has the best of Auden's groundmindedness. The summer holds. Upon its glittering lake lie Europe and the islands, many rivers wrinkling her surface like a ploughman's palm. Under the bellies of the grazing horses on the far side of posts and bridge, the vigorous shadows dwindle. Nothing wavers. Between the cathedrals and the wide feminine valleys where dragonflies race above the still and treacherous reaches, between the big farms and the arterial roads, we show you a hedgeless country, the source of streams. And we have here again this view of various landscapes, these rapid series of changes. This is something that aviation stopped being solely a poetic convenience. It's made what was a poetic convenience, a poetic cliche almost, it's made it into a reality. This, I think, is even stronger in the revised version of these lines Auden wrote for The Dog Beneath the Skin from 1935, which was the collaboration with Christopher Isherwood that remolded The Chase into a play that actually could be performed, has been performed, not very often. And there was a interesting revival of it at the Jermyn Street Theatre 2 years ago, maybe. And instead of showing the hedgeless country, the source of streams, which also I think is a description that perhaps makes more sense visually, thinking of the view from above, the chorus invites the audience to choose. Wherever your heart directs you most longingly to look, you are loving towards it. Whether north to Scots Gap and Bellingham, where the black rams defy the panting engine, or west to the Welsh marches, most longingly to look. And for the first time, this is the first time in literature, in history, in this moment, the early 20th century, for the first time, this looking does not really have to be from solely a high tower in the mind. Bleak House, Inspector Bucket goes for a high tower in his mind. It's part of the prehistory of ground-mindedness. The prehistory almost of aviation imagery is Inspector Bucket imagining going up and looking down over the Leicestershire landscape. So the audience could, and I think should, also envisage something far more physical, far more literal, when hearing these words. It's no longer just poetry in one sense. I realize it sounds quite almost pathetic and banal. I don't want it to be. I think it's really quite important that what is being conjured up in the audience's mind is something they literally could one day see or could already have seen, which would not have been the case before the early 20th century, quite simply in this way. So this is, again, above all the case, given that Auden had really prepared the public for this with the first 3 lines in the play. The summer holds. Upon its glittering lake lie Europe and the irons, many rivers wrinkling the surface like a ploughman's palm. And this is a series of, I do love these lines. This is a series of images that get their power, I would argue, from the visual stimulus given by the experience from looking out from a modern aircraft. Europe and its surrounding islands lying in a haze of sunshine on summer water is an image surely familiar to anyone who, on a clear summer's day, has flown over the Channel, over the shores of the Mediterranean. And the poetic sensibility that can reduce a continent and its rivers to a ploughman's palm and its wrinkles is informed by the reality of seeing the flatlands of Europe, the hills ironed out by altitude, scored by rivers, only the lines of which, just like wrinkles, are visible. So in other words, I'd argue these images are amongst the finest descriptions we have of a landmass seen from the skies. And the power of their effect on the reader's unconscious, let's call it that if you like, comes and came not only from the simple beauty of the imagery, whether it's outlandish or obvious, but from the way in which it reports for the first time in history what its hearers may themselves actually have seen or be willing one day potentially to see. Another early Auden play, Dance of Death from 1933, which was performed in the group theatre, been put on once or twice since, I think. It appears to contain, in the dancer's temporary and eventually fatal transformations, I'm not going to go into the plot of the Dance of Death, the dancer eventually fatally transforms into the pilot with a capital P. This would appear, and it's being quoted by people like Cunningham, as one of the summations of Auden's air-mindedness in the way that concept is normally used, that focus on the flyer, on the aircraft. Who will be the one to teach us how to fly from the alone to the alone? Now, this would appear to be Auden rather audaciously fusing the end of Plotinus' Enneads, Fugge mono pros monon, which usually in English is a flight of the alone to the alone. Fusing Plotinus with modern air-mindedness through that bivalence of the semantic field around flight in the sense of escape, flight in the sense of flying. And changes the translation, the genitive changes mono from of the alone to from the alone. Okay, that I think is the way that those lines are generally read. That idea again of the flyer as one alone, going back sometimes to Plotinus and the rest of it, with only in the context of that line, of course, staying roughly with that relatively traditional, almost cliche idea of air-mindedness, the flyer, all of that. I think though that if we look around a bit more, there is a more likely source than Plotinus directly, and a source that in fact brings us back to groundmindedness. So that was from Auden writes The Dance of Death in 33, I think, maybe 32. Much later, final year of his life, he notes that he's never read the Enneads. It's one of his reviews, he'd never read the Enneads. He'd never read this line of Plotinus whether in the original Greek or in translation, he hadn't read the Enneads. So where might then his knowledge of this quite well-known line of Plotinus have come from? It's found in his good friend E.R. Dodds's 1923 book, Select Passages Illustrating Neoplatonism, where it's translated A Flight of the Alone to the Alone. And Dodds's book, The Ancient Concept of Progress and Other Essays on Greek Literature and Belief, was the subject of the review just before his death, in which Auden admitted his ignorance of the Enneads. So, but given that and the lack of reference to this earlier work, would suggest, at least to me, that Auden hadn't read Plotinus even in extract in Dodds's 1923 anthology. The air-minded pun, so around flight, also appears in the later book, of which Auden was a co-author, Letters from Iceland in 1936, Lewis MacNeice's Eclogue from Iceland, where Ryan, who's MacNeice, speaks of the Irish writer, whose version of Plotinus was the most famous in the 1930s, whose version of these words was also A Flight of the Alone to the Alone. There was McKenna, spent 20 years translating Greek philosophy, ill and tormented, unable to break contract, brilliant talker who left the salon for the solo flight of mind. The solo flight of mind, clearly buried and punning allusion to Plotinus. MacNeice was a classicist, a friend of Dodds, who would be the executor, in fact, as well as his colleague in the classics department at Birmingham between 1930 and 1936. So MacNeice, of course, certainly have been far more familiar with Plotinus than Auden was. We could posit that Auden had, by 1933, come to contact with Plotinus' phrase through his friendship with MacNeice, if not through that with Dodds. Okay, I would like to argue there is another more suggestive, from my ground-minded, if you like, point of view, possibility for a source for this line of Auden's that does not require us to assume either the failure of Auden's memory, that he did know this line of Plotinus but had forgotten it, forgotten that he knew it from Valentine, as it were, or any form of totally pointless and rather unlikely dishonesty. One of Auden's favourite writers, Charles Williams, published The Place of the Lion in 1931. Like much of Williams' work, its basic premise is deeply unusual. I'm going to try and give you a very brief summary of the plot of The Place of the Lion. I cannot do this without making it sound ridiculous. I apologise to any Charles Williams fans. Platonic archetypes appear in the shape of animals and try to take over a small town in Hertfordshire. They're big Platonic archetypes and they're animals wandering around Hertfordshire. So at a certain point, Richardson, one of the heroes, pauses by a Wesleyan chapel and muses that all that sort of thing was very well for the minds that could use it. He couldn't use it, neither the small, dull gatherings of the evangelicals or the large, gaudy assemblies of the Catholics. And then, in inverted commas, the flight of the alone to the alone. So this direct quote, probably from McKenna's translation or possibly Dodd's, flight is fleeing, which is in fact the meaning of fugue. In the Greek does not allow the pun. The Plotinus Greek does not allow that pun that you have in English between flight as flying and flight as in running away, as in fleeing. Here, though, it is flight in the sense of fleeing, flight in the original Greek sense. So that, though, given that Auden knew Williams's work very well, gives us a possible source for Auden's line, The Dance of Death, that wouldn't contradict his 1973 statement of not knowing the Enneads. But most interestingly for me is in the novel, in Place of the Lion, there's also imagery of the type that I'm calling ground-minded. So in various examples, the best example of this comes quite near this passage involving this Plotinus quote. Comes in another of the book's heroes, Anthony Durand. He faces, I realize how ridiculous this sounds, he faces the lion of strength after he's seen the eagle of balance, and he has a vision which includes the pterodactyl, which is a perverted form of the eagle. I mean, if you haven't read the novel, I can't do it justice by this description, but this is really what it is like. A memory of all insane things awoke in him of the flying he had done in the last year of the war. It seems as if again he looked down on a wide stretch of land and sea, but no human habitations were there, only forest and plain and river and huge saurians creeping slowly up from the waters, and here and there other giant beasts coming to sight for a moment and then disappearing. Another flying thing went past below him, a hideous shape, this is the pterodactyl. There was a mockery of the clear air in which he was riding the machine that, without his control, was now sweeping down towards the ground. He was plunging towards a prehistoric world. A lumbering vasticity went over an open space far in front, and behind it his own world broke again into being through that other. There was a wild minute in which the two were mingled. Mammoths and Dinotheria wandered among hedges of English fields, and in that confused vision he felt the machine make easy landing, run, and come to a stop. And we have here a link to modernity of flying, of looking down a wide stretch of land and sea, its connection with the First World War, prefiguring Cunningham's later observation in British writers of the 30s, that the air was the only location where it was, after the war, widely supposed heroics to survive the general disillusionments consequent upon wartime active service in the cleaner, freer element, heroically superior to the troglodyte infantry, shut into the dark and grim trenches below. However, this is clearly, I think, from the way I'm arguing, primarily a spiritual vision and figurative ascension. But once again, there is an awareness of the physicality and literality of what previously necessarily would only have been figurative. And it's this literalizing of the figurative that I think that makes it ground-minded. And given the prevalence of ground-minded imagery in Auden's work, given his love of Charles Williams's work, it suggests to me very strongly the Place of the Lion as a likely source for Auden's seeming knowledge of Plotinus, as Auden does, combines a superficially air-minded flight of the alone with a much more historically moored ground-mindedness. So, although ground-mindedness, in my reading of this, saw its birth in the 1930s, late 1920s, it clearly did not die with that dishonest low decay. There, the pun is unavoidable, but I think rather useful. Examples of what we might call the pilot's gaze can be found throughout Auden's work, right up to his death, really. I shall leave this to everyone who wishes to read through Auden's complete poetry. Couple of examples. Except, so this is from 40 years on in 1968, except where blast furnaces and generating stations have inserted their sharp profiles, or a throughway slashes harshly across them, Bohemia's contours look just as amiable now as when I saw them first. And in fact, it's 1954, Ode to Gaia, we actually have the most explicit formulation of what Auden by that point had been doing intermittently for almost 30 years. This brings me to the title of this paper. From this new culture of the air, we finally see, far shining in excellence, what our mother, the nicest daughter of chaos, would admire could she look in a glass. So the historical rarity a massive historical rarity. What Auden and others were doing in these years, I think, really cannot be exaggerated. The history of literature over centuries has, of course, seen the emergence of countless new themes, mediated through countless new sensibilities. Nature has been discovered, childhood, courtly love, modernity. The examples are perhaps endless, and the scholarly literature on them huge and far beyond my competence. Hugely rarer, though, I think, is something like what I'm calling groundmindedness here. The introduction to literature of a literally new visual subject, the birth of something that had never been seen before in that way, the birth through technological change and advance in aviation technology of a whole literal whole new way of seeing and thence describing the world. Thank you.